We have the Sony A9 III, a $6,000 sports camera, and this thing is unbelievable. It's got the best autofocus we have ever used. It's just 120 frames per second, and it even has a pre-capture feature, and it works really well. We're going to compare it to the Canon R3, the Nikon Z8, and the Sony Alpha 1 and tell you what the differences are. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, Adorama. If you're taking pictures or video, they have everything a creator could possibly want. They understand you. They have lighting, lenses, cameras, accessories. They have great deals. Anything you could hope for is there. And they even have a VIP program with points. Be sure to use the links down below if you're shopping for your new gear. That lets Adorama know we're doing a great job. Thanks, Adorama.
This is a full-frame mirrorless camera with 24 megapixels. It has a beautiful 9 million dot viewfinder, and you can see a couple of dials on the top, though there is no top LCD screen. It has my favorite type of rear screen, which is a flippy screen that flip forwards or also tilts up or down. So you can't possibly complain because it does absolutely everything. The grip feels fantastic. It's a little bit deeper, and you can see they've tilted the shutter button there a little bit, which I think makes it feel a little bit more like a Z8, which is a good thing.
Let's talk about the autofocus because it is spectacular. There are a ton of autofocus points, and they cover 95% of the frame. But just practically using this camera, I noticed how good the autofocus was. I was taking pictures of people playing volleyball, and I was locking focus on them through the net, and it was just keeping the focus in place. I think it's better than the Alpha 1 at this point. I'll have to do more testing and really spend more time with this camera, but so far it just seems like an amazing autofocus system on a super fast camera.
The standout feature here is the global shutter. This is the first camera I've ever used with a global shutter. That means that it reads out the entire sensor without a mechanical shutter instantly. That is a 0 millisecond readout speed. And the importance of that is you will never get any kind of flickering.
To understand the importance of readout speed in sports, let's go back to 2017 when Sony launched the original A9. Jared Polin found banding issues in about 2% of his shots, those illuminated by flickering advertising on the sidelines rather than the professional stadium lights. 6 years later, the new A9 Mark III wouldn't show the flickering in those shots. Yet, apart from Jared's very valid example, I can't find anyone complaining about banding from professional stadium lights with current mirrorless sports cameras like the R3, Z8, Z9, or A1. All the banding complaints I find are from concert lighting with fast shutter speeds. Perhaps the A9 III's global shutter will be more valuable to concert photographers than sports photographers.
That also unlocks some pretty cool features like 120 frames per second RAW, not JPEGs like you might get out of a Nikon or an R3. That gives you a lot of versatility. It's also not that limited. Like, we found it really usable in the real world, and that, I think, makes this the best sports camera I've ever used by like an order of magnitude.
Some of you were saying nobody needs 120 frames per second. Well, maybe not, but it does help. This sequence of 8 photos was taken at 120 frames per second, and there's one shot that shows the perfect moment where the athlete's hand spikes the volleyball. At a measly 30 frames per second, you'd get only 2 of those frames, and it's possible the photographer would completely miss the ball in the shot.
That global shutter is also really powerful when you're using strobes. See, strobes have a sync speed on the camera, which limits the shutter speed that you can use with a strobe before you have to switch into high-speed sync mode.
Removing the flash sync limitation from the camera moves the performance bottleneck to the strobe. Hasselblad's leaf shutters have provided unlimited sync speed for years. In testing the leaf shutter with our very fast Flashpoint 8600 Pro, we only managed to get effective results at 1/640th. When we increased the shutter to 1/1250th, it was now shorter than our flash duration, which meant all the light didn't reach Chelsea, and now it was no longer effective. We didn't get to test the Sony A9 Mark III with a strobe outside, but you would see these same problems. Like all flashes, our Flashpoint 8600 Pro duration increases as you increase the power output. At minimum power, the duration is 1/10,000th of a second, but that's not enough light to fill a softbox or overpower the sun. At maximum power, the flash duration is a relatively long 1/220th of a second and will only work effectively with longer shutter speeds. In Sony's indoor demonstration, they used the Profoto Pro 10, an AC-powered pack-and-head system that will cost over $20,000 with a single strobe. At minimum power, it will sync with the A9 III at an amazing 1/80,000th of a second. However, in full sun with a big softbox, you'll need full power, and even the world's fastest flash is a relatively slow 1/1000th duration at full power, meaning the A9 III's effective sync speed would be something longer than that. For portrait photographers hoping to use the unlimited sync speed to overpower the sun, the Sony A1 might actually be a better choice. The A1's mechanical shutter has a sync speed of 1/400th and a base ISO of 100. The A9 III's sync is limited by the strobe, but the base ISO is 250. In order to control the ambient light with the A9 III, you need a strobe that could sync at 1/1000th of a second just to match the A1's performance because of the A9 III's higher base ISO. In summary, the A9 III's fast flash sync is a win indoors or at night, but photographers fighting the sun are better served by an A1 or a Hasselblad. Now, Sony has a couple on-camera flashes that sync with the A9 III at any speed, but on-camera flash is kind of ugly and relatively low powered, which is probably why Sony's examples are shot at night. Those examples are valid, but I don't want you spending $6,000 based on the assumption that you can get similar results in daylight. You can't.
The maximum shutter speed on this is actually insane. It's 1/80,000th. 80,000. Not 8,000, 80,000. That's with one shot. If you want to do like high speed shooting, then it goes down to 1/16,000. Oh, boo-hoo. 16,000, that's still a lot. When it comes to the frames per second, it maxes out at 120 frames per second. And you do get some buffering, but you kind of naturally learn how to manage that. So you're like pushing off of the shutter, pushing down to get bursts of action. And then you're waiting for your buffer a little bit, but I didn't find that it was interrupting my shooting. I also use pre-capture, which is pretty amazing. That's a feature where you can take a picture and then it actually is recording your images you're taking 30 seconds before you press the shutter. There's so much magic happening within this little camera. So if you're doing something like taking pictures of volleyball, like we're doing, you don't miss the moment where they're perfectly hitting the volleyball. I was able to get every bit of play within the game just because I had that extra half a second to make sure I was getting my focus on the right player. I'm so excited to try this feature with wildlife because it's going to be a dream for birds.
For video, it's not going to blow you away. It's mainly a stills camera, but it does 4K at 120 frames per second, full width, or 4K at 60 frames per second, downsampled from 6K. So that's really high quality video. 422, 10-bit, all that stuff. Also, it's pretty versatile for hybrid shooters. You might want to use it for sports, portraits, weddings, and video because it does have a flippy screen here. That's also a tilt screen. That's something that the Nikon doesn't offer. There are a couple of gotchas. We found the battery wore out pretty fast. They do offer a vertical grip for it, so I would either get that for a game or pack a couple of extra batteries. Also, the minimum standard ISO is ISO 250. So you can go down to ISO 150 and it's an extended ISO. I think that's really important for sports photographers because you frequently need to actually use a slow shutter. You want to drag the shutter in order to show motion, especially for things like race cars. But you do it for runners and stuff too when you just want to get a little creative with it. Of course, you can still go to longer shutter speeds in sun. It just means you're going to have to attach an ND filter. If you had, say, a Nikon Z8 or Z9, you could actually go 2 stops slower on your shutter before you needed to bust out the ND filter.
Sony says the A9 Mark III offers 8 stops of stabilization. In our tests, we got 100% sharp shots with the 70-200 at 2 stops below the reciprocal rule. By the time we got to 3 stops, it had dropped to about 50% sharp shots, and that number had dropped to 0 at 5 stops below the reciprocal rule. So maybe not as good as we expected.
We're going to compare it side by side with the Z8 and the Canon R3 and the Sony A1. But first I want to thank our sponsor, Adorama. Adorama is where we get all our new photography gear because they're the store that understands creators. They have fast shipping, amazing customer service, and you know what? They save you money because every time you buy something, they give you VIP points. And I currently have more than 20,000 VIP points saved up. That means I can get a lot off of my next purchase. Be sure to use our links anytime you shop for camera gear so that they know you heard about them through us and they keep making unbiased videos like this possible.
So you're trying to choose between the Alpha 1 and the A9 III, where here are the biggest differences. First of all, the A1 has 50 megapixels and the A9 III has 24. That makes the A9 III more ideal for sports because you might want more resolution for when you're taking wildlife photos when you have to crop. The A9 III shoots 120 frames per second and the Alpha 1 has 30 frames per second. Both of them are still really high frame rate, but I think that you're going to appreciate those extra frames for sports. Another thing is the lowest ISO possible. It's 100 on the Alpha 1 and it's 250 on the A9. The Alpha 1 does 8K and the A9 does 4K, so that's something you'll want to consider if you're shooting video. Overall, I think they're both great cameras, but I would choose the A9 if you are more interested in sports and some general photos, and the Alpha 1 if you're shooting wildlife and also general photos.
Should you get the A9 or the R3? Oh, the R3 is an amazing camera, and it does have some strengths compared to the A9. Like, I really like the top screen here. I also really like that it uses a CF Express Type B card, though it has asymmetric cards, so if you write to both cards, it could be bottlenecked on the SD card. The A9 uses CF Express Type A cards, which are about half the speed and significantly more expensive. I wish Sony had gone with CF Express Type B. But shooting sports, real world, the A9 Mark III was so much better than the R3. Like, this advertises over 150 frames per second, which sounds like it would beat this, except when you enable that mode, first you're limited to JPEG only, but when you press the shutter, it takes all those pictures all at once, and so you can't just shoot in little bursts. It also freezes the camera up, so you can't keep shooting, and that's just not how real world sports work. So you might set up a shot if you were gonna get it, or maybe it would work for a golf swing. But real world, the way the A9 Mark III works with its high frame rate is just significantly more effective. The Sony also has a much better EVF, and I really like the colors better. I know Sony has a bad rep for colors, but we did a blind study, and it seems like people actually prefer the Sony's colors. Also, the Canon has no pre-buffer, a feature that they put in the R7, but they didn't put into the higher end R3, so I kind of miss that. And of course, really, it's the readout speed. This is a very fast readout speed. Like, real world, people aren't getting a lot of banding or anything in low light, and nor are people really complaining about how strobes work, but the global shutter is a clear advantage for the Sony. Should you get the A9 III or the Z8 Nikon Z9? They're both really fast cameras, but the Z8 and Z9 have a couple of big benefits, like they're 45 megapixels, like almost twice as many as the A9. So if you're doing wildlife or you might want to crop in, Nikon has a big advantage here. The Nikon body, bulkier, but it feels good, especially on the Z9. And the Nikons have a top screen that I really like to use. The Nikons also do 8K at 60 frames per second, which really blows away the amount of detail that you get out of an A9. Not everybody needs that, but I like the Nikons when I'm doing wildlife video because I can then crop in post, and that really helps me out a lot. The Nikons have CF Express Type B cards, which I like better than the CF Express Type A cards. The autofocus on the Nikon, I actually found it performed better than the R3, which surprised me that Nikon was now beating Canon, but it didn't perform quite as well as the new A9. So Sony is really in the lead there. Both these cameras offer 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, but the A9 has some advantages. Like, it'll shoot RAW on those, whereas you're only getting JPEG out of the two Nikon cameras. And if you shoot 60 frames per second with the Nikon, you're now at 19 megapixels as opposed to 24 here. If you shoot 120 frames per second, you're getting 11 out of the Nikon compared to still 24 here. I also like the implementation better. If you want to switch between 30, 60, 90 on the Nikon, you kind of have to press a button and change it, which means you can't do it in the moment, whereas Sony gave you a button that you push that just puts it into turbo boost mode, and it switches from whatever your default high speed is to 120 frames per second. So good on Sony for working out the workflow a little bit better. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe. And if you have further questions, we're going to be doing more reviews of these, so write a comment down below.
In our next review, we'll test production copies in a real-world environment, and we'll be able to check the image quality because we'll finally be able to look at the RAW files.
And of course, whenever you're shopping for camera gear, support our sponsor because that helps support us and helps support unbiased reviews. Go to this link at Adorama, where you will find the fastest shipping, the most things in stock, the best customer support, people, human beings who can answer your questions, and of course, VIP points that earn you money every time you buy something so you can get more stuff because you know what? We all love gear. Thanks and bye.